Okay, and oh darn, I should have. Wait, next, now I'm going to. All right, there we go. Now I just got to find my notes. Okay, so last week we mentioned. Oh, okay. Also, I want to share the screen. Okay, share screen. It is desktop 2. Okay. Okay, you all should now see. Let's see if I can make it bigger. You should be able to see the text of the Shema. Can you see that? Because I always get confused what I'm showing people.
Yeah.
Okay, you can see Shema. Okay, great. All right. So last week we talked about the Shema itself, and I mentioned that according to Dr. Kilman, the reason why originally in this proto service that the Mishnah talks about during the time of the temple, where the Shema was recited as part of the worship experience, but there was also the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments was the introduction to the Shema. And the reason, according to, the reason, the traditional reason why, at least the Mishnah gives us, as to why they stopped saying the 10 Commandments was because of these menim, which are usually understood as heretics or other cult groups. And they, because they believed that only the 10 Commandments were significant, that only those 10 were given by God. Nothing, everything else was given by Moses, the lawgiver, and not direct from God. It's possible that they were the early Jewish Christians. It's not really clear, but that's their explanation. According to Rabbi Kimmelman, that really doesn't make any sense, because that's a really pretty weak reason to stop saying this significant textual component in your worship services, because maybe a few people who are, disgruntled former Jews or whatever, or breakoffs from Jews are now dissing your use of the 10 Commandments. So he says, no, that makes more sense the way he describes the reason for what the meaning of the Shema is. It makes more sense that, in fact, there was no need for the 10 Commandments, because everything the 10 Commandments could present, this confirmation ceremony of or coronation of God as the one true God, the belief that God gave the mitzvot to the Jewish people. All of this stuff is really found in the Shema itself. And so therefore it doesn't need to be, you don't need the 10 Commandments. You can, as part of your liturgical experience, the Shema does all of it. It does it better than having the 10 Commandments. Shema speaks of all the commandments, right? All these words. It speaks about the V'ahavta adds the component of love. It's not just we're obedient to God because God is the creator of the world and is the lawgiver, but rather we're obedient because God loves us, and we have this relationship with God. So that's his explanation. And just as to follow up on that, I wanted to point out that there's a number of midrashim in which the sages, and this one comes from the Jerusalem Talmud, where they try to pair up the 10 Commandments with the Shema, which is a way of kind of saying the same thing that Rabbi Kilman was saying, which is, we've got the 10 Commandments within the Shema anyway, so we don't really need them. They don't line up great, but a lot of it does. So the Lord is our God, Adonai Eloheinu. Well, that fits with the beginning of the 10 Commandments. I'm the Lord. The Lord is one. Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Well, that's the second commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall love the Lord. They understand as no using God's name in vain. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house. That's number 10. You shouldn't covet what other people have. In the third paragraph, it talks about, in the second paragraph, it talks about you will gather in your grain, right? If you do the mitzvot, everything's going to work out great, and you'll gather in your grain. No stealing. Don't take anybody else's grain. If you don't observe the commandments, then you will perish quickly. No murder. In order that your days be multiplied, that's the end of the second paragraph. It refers to the land that God swore to your ancestors, your parents. Well, there's honor your mother and father. In paragraph 3, it talks about not straying after your eyes. Well, that would lead to adultery. And that you may remember and do all my commandments. They suggest that that's about Shabbat, because, of course, the beginning of the Shabbat commandment is Zachor, remember. And finally, at the conclusion, I'm the Lord your God. That's at the end of the third paragraph. That's do not bear false witness, because God just told you God was the Lord, and don't say that he isn't. So they try to mush the 10 commandments into the 3 paragraphs of the Shema. So there's another example of why there really isn't a need for the 10 commandments in the worship service. You've already got it included. I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the second paragraph. So that's that one right here. And this paragraph was a little bit controversial in the modern era. The Reform movement saw it as and it's understood as the basic concept of reward and punishment. And that if we do good, then good things happen to us. If we don't do what God wants, if we're disobedient, then bad things happen to us. This is obviously a controversial notion, especially the way it's presented here. So here's the paragraph, at least the translation of in the conservative prayer book, Sidur Sim Shalom. If you will earnestly heed the mitzvot, if you observe them, that I'm giving you this day, to love the Lord your God and to serve God with all your heart and all your soul, then I will favor your land with rain at the proper season, in autumn and in spring, and you will have an ample harvest of grain, wine, and oil. I will assure abundance in the fields for your cattle. You will eat to contentment. Okay, so that's the good stuff. If you observe, and notice that it's very not so different from the first paragraph, right? It's about loving, if you love God. Here it talks about lave and nefesh. It doesn't mention meod like it did in the first paragraph. Here's where's the Hebrew here? Right here, it's got ula avdo b'chol levavchem uv'chol nafshechem. That parallels up here levavcha and nafshecha, but it is missing meod. And then okay, so that's the first part. That's the good stuff. Now take care lest you be tempted to stray and to worship false gods, for then Adonai's wrath will be directed against you. The God will close the heavens and hold back the rain. The earth will not yield its produce. You will soon disappear from the good land which the Adonai is giving you. Therefore, impress these words of mine upon your heart. Bind them as a sign upon your hand. Let them be a reminder above your eyes. Teach them to your children. Repeat them at home and away, night and day. Inscribe them upon the doorposts of your homes and upon your gates. Now, notice that's very similar to up here. Here, teach them diligently to your children. Recite them at home, away, at night and day. Bind them. We have the tefillin passage up here, also the mezuzah passage. And then your days and your days of your children on the land that the Adonai swore to give your ancestors will endure as the days of the heavens over earth. So you can see a little bit why this is controversial, because, I mean, that's not the way the world works. I mean, you can have horrible places, horrible countries, people who do terrible things, even, when Jews do terrible things. And that doesn't seem to connect with whether the rain falls or doesn't fall. So this was kind of controversial. Now this understanding, though, that it's reward and punishment goes back all the way to Sadia Gaon in the 9th century of Babylonia and Judah Halevi in the 12th century of Spain. So they saw this right away as an idea of reward and punishment. The Mishnah, all the way back in the Mishnah, third century, explains the second paragraph as about the mitzvot, the commitment to observe the mitzvot. But by Sadia Gaon and Yehuda Levi, these medieval scholars understood it not just as the importance of observing mitzvot, but that it's about reward and punishment, which are core principles for them in traditional Judaism, that God will reward those who do good and God punishes those who don't. Now, the Reform movement, though, modern period, had a problem with this. And they dealt with the theological challenge of this notion, not just reward and punishment in the sense of like, I don't know, I don't know, I can't think of anything, example, but if I don't do the right thing, if I don't follow the commandments, I eat a ham sandwich, that it'll redound back to me. But that the idea of if the Jewish people are not observing the mitzvot, then the nature is going to change. So the way they dealt with it was just by taking out this paragraph. So I grew up in the Reform movement. We just didn't recite this paragraph. It wasn't in there. Only the last half of the third paragraph was in the Reform movement's prayer book. So while our life experience belies the simple expression of nature as the stage for acting out reward for good behavior and punishment for disobedience, by reciting this paragraph, we acknowledge what Judaism does believe to be true, that our moral and immoral actions have consequences. So that's kind of by taking out that paragraph, you do lose that sense of this belief in Judaism that there are consequences to our behavior. Now, we may not grasp the consequences immediately, they may be beyond our comprehension, but we deeply believe that justice will out and that God will act justly, just not on necessarily our time schedule. Now, we also note that what's key about this paragraph, and you can't really tell in the English, so let's go back to the Hebrew here, is that it's in plural, which is different from the first paragraph. First paragraph is v'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha. That's second person plural, so it's you, the individual. Here it begins v'haya im shemo tishmeu el mitzvotai asher anochi mitzveh etchem hayom. That's in the second person plural. So that's one thing to notice, that this paragraph is about corporate Israel. This is about the Jewish people as a whole. And it's not about if I eat a ham sandwich, then I'm going to be punished necessarily, or directly, but that rather what the Jewish people as a whole don't follow God's word, then there will be significant consequences, significantly exile, which we know from the prophetic period, that's how they understood it. That the people of the north, the northern kingdom, Israel, that's what Amos and Hosea are coming to rail against. And of course, exile follows. Then Isaiah and Ezekiel, or the other prophets. Who else? I'm trying to think of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the one who really comes to criticize Judea, and then they're exiled. So in the context of the Torah, it's the people not following, disobeying God's rule as a group. So that's one significant, distinction between, some of our anxiety about this notion of reward and punishment. So it doesn't speak of reward and punishment to the individual based on individual behavior. And in this way, the second paragraph is distinguished from the first paragraph, which is in the singular. Each person is expected to strive to love God, but it's the community's behavior that may cause disasters to affect it. These punishments are national in scope, and the prophets as well emphasize the dangers to the community. Now, there's an attempt years ago by a prominent thinker, he lives in Israel now, Danny Gordis. This was years ago when he was living in the States, and he wrote about how he saw this paragraph making sense because the challenge is that we don't see in the world around us, we don't see how nature is impacted by immoral behavior, right? But he said, looking at the environment, and this is well before we were talking about climate change, he said, wait a minute, there is some reality to this. When the relationship, the link between moral behavior and natural disaster is not so far-fetched. Climate change, the destruction of the ozone layer, the loss of polar ice caps, the rising of the seas, the violence and extreme weather. At the time, actually, what motivated him was, I don't know if you remember, acid rain. Acid rain was killing a lot of forests because the rain was coming down. It wasn't good for the forests, it was bad. All of this is due, according to most reliable and trustworthy scientists, to human action. So whether cutting down rainforests in the Amazon to harvest raspberries for our consumption, or the overfishing of seas, the continued use of dirty fuels, and many other practices whose dangers to the environment are known, and yet we accept them. Why? Because money's at stake. So this sense of this greediness, this rapaciousness of human beings, lack of concern for people's well-being, but rather taking advantage of nature for our, for rapacious and cupidity. These are harmful actions which divert humanity from their divinely entrusted goal as stewards of the earth. And in that case, you can read it. There are real consequences to such behaviors. When we treat the earth as simply a resource for ourselves, and especially for the wealthiest to gain more wealth, and maybe there is some comeuppance, maybe there is some consequence to the world and to all of us because of that. So that's another way of reading it, as reward and punishment, but on a much grander scale. How the environment is impacted by our behaviors. So while at first it seems unrealistic that our collective immoral behaviors should draw a negative natural response, as life becomes more unlivable or dangerous for large swaths of the planet, hurricanes, monsoons, higher and higher temperatures, we must finally acknowledge the growing truth of that biblical threat. So that's another way of reading it, right? The first one is the way that the medievalists read it is, this is reward and punishment. Jews don't disobey God, they get exiled, they get punished. Danny Gordis is there's a reality to this. There's nature is impacted by our lack of concern for humanity. But Reuven Kimmelman has a different way of reading it, and I think it's actually a much more appropriate one, or a much more realistic one. And it's because he does it by reading the text and looking for parallels in biblical Hebrew about how Hebrew grammar and arguments are structured. So he points out that the reason the two paragraphs are juxtaposed has more to do with the reorganization and re-thematization by the second paragraph of the first. So most significant for Dr. Kimmelman is the greater emphasis on educating the next generation. You notice that both paragraphs, we pointed it out, talk about tefillin, talk about mezuzot. They both mention teaching children. Let's go back to the English here. Okay, they both talk about teaching children. In the first paragraph, the focus is on the individual. In the second paragraph, we mentioned it's in plural. All the parts, teaching children tefillin mezuzah, are all subject to the idea of you shall take to heart. So he says, you shall take to heart, teach them diligently to your children, till it follows. What does it mean to take them to your heart? To take the teachings to your heart? Well, you act on them. You teach to your children, you speak about them, you study them, you bind them on your arm, you put a reminder between your eyes. Okay, that is, okay. But in the second paragraph, placing these words on your heart takes on a more literal meaning. Let's see, here, notice in the second paragraph, impress these words of mine upon your heart, bind them as a sign upon your hand, let them be a reminder for your above your eyes. The literal meaning comes first, then teach your children. So there's a little switch in order here. He says by changing the order in the paragraph, by placing these words on your heart, which takes a more literal meaning, that is, you actually put them on your heart and between your eyes, teaching children these words in addition to speaking them when you are in your home and along the road when you go to bed and wake up, also mezuzot around the house, they become part of the education program. The second paragraph also emphasizes the end goal of observing the mitzvot, that your children should follow in your ways and be blessed with enduring settlement in the land, so that your days and days of your children may multiply in the land that Adonai swore to you and to your ancestors to give you them as long as there is a heaven over the earth. So if your education system works, you're going to therefore be able to stay in the land, because otherwise, and we're going to talk a little bit about this in the history class on a week from Monday, Jews assimilated a lot of ideas, even in the land of Israel. They were assimilating the Hellenistic ideas after Hellenism and Alexander the Great, and he brought Hellenism to the Levant. Jews were imbibing these ideas. So unless your education system is strong, you're going to have people drifting away from Judaism. So, and the teachings of the Torah. So that's why the educational program is so significant in part 2 in its connection to the land. Now, the conventional way of understanding the second paragraph is, as I mentioned, that it was a reward for observing the mitzvot. We do this stuff, we obey God, good things happen to us, and good things, and especially the land. Well, the land will provide abundance. And he says that, but there's a problem with the Hebrew grammar here, or the grammatical structure. He says the paragraph was understood this way by reading the letter Vav in the opening verse as setting up a conditional statement. If you will earnestly, that's how they've got it here. If you will earnestly heed the mitzvot, then good things happen. Meaning that the second part where it says, take care lest you be tempted to stray, would be also an if statement. Or maybe then it's a then statement. No, that's also an if statement, right? If you will heed the mitzvot, then I will favor your land. If you are tempted to stray, then I hold back the rain. That's how it's being understood. But he says that's not how it works. That if you look at another example from Deuteronomy chapter 28, which is the one of the Tochecha passages in the Torah. In chapter 28, we also have a shorter one in the book of Numbers, where God says, it's the kind of the what do I want to say, the fine print in the contract, in the covenant that Israel has made with God, where Moses says, V'haya im shamo tishma, very similar language to what we have here. If you would, I probably should have, well, okay, I guess I'll translate here. Okay. If you will listen to the voice of God, to follow God's ways and do the mitzvot, then Baruch atah ba'ir u'baruch atah b'sadeh. There's this whole section on blessed will you be in the city and blessed will you be in the field, all this good stuff. And then comes the Tochecha, this long list of curses. It's really unpleasant to practice reading that when you're a Torah reader, because it's one graphic example of horrors that will occur to the people when they don't follow. But the key thing here is it parallels that opening statement. V'haya im lo tishma b'kol Adonai. If you do not listen to the Lord your God, to observe God's words and commandments that I'm commanding you this day, then arur, then you will be cursed in the city and cursed in the field. And then it's a long, long passage of the of curses, of terrible things that will happen to the people. The point is that they're parallel. V'haya im shamoa tishma, if you will observe. V'haya im lo tishma. But that's not the language here. That's not how our paragraph works. Our paragraph works, it begins, V'haya im shamoa tishma'u, if you will earnestly heed the mitzvot. And then it goes on to say, and I give you all this good stuff, Hishamru lachem. Take care lest you be seduced, your heart be seduced, and you turn away and you serve other gods. And then God's going to be really angry. So Kimmelman's explanation is, it should be read this way. If you heed my commandments, I will provide rain and crops. Take heed not to worship other gods. Otherwise, God's anger will flare up and the bounty will cease and you will lose the land. So what's the significance of the change of meaning? Here, there is now expressed a concern with the relationship that God's bountifulness will lead to idolatry rather than gratitude, that the goodness of God's gift for obedience will promote arrogance and self-aggrandizement, which is what we see in other parts of the book of Deuteronomy. Constantly, they're reminded, don't think when things are so good, you're living in the land and everything is great, don't say, oh, it's because of me and my ability that got all this good stuff. Moses is constantly telling the people, it is because God is good to you. It has nothing to do with you. You could be the best farmer in the world, but if God takes away the rain, you're going to starve. So just be conscious of that it's not about you. It's about your commitment to God. So as Kimmelman writes, the second paragraph of the Shema is worried about the effects of affluence on the loyalty of the people, because both because material success leads to arrogance and thus rebellion against God, and it inspires the worship of fertility gods who were believed by many in the ancient Near East, including the Canaanites, to be the cause of agricultural fecundity. And in the song that closes Deuteronomy, Moses even sings about this. So Yeshurun, that's Israel, grew fat and kicked. You grew fat and gross and coarse. He forsook the God who made him and spurned the rock of his support. They incensed God with alien things, vexed God with abomination. So really, so according to Kimmelman, which I find very meaningful today, even more so than Danny Gordis, his connection between abusing the earth and then the consequences. But here it's the danger of affluence, the connection between wealth and idolatry. And then here, this is what I mentioned before, in Deuteronomy 6, right after the Shema, here's the text, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that God swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to assign to you great and flourishing cities that you did not build, houses full of all good things that you did not fill, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, and you eat your fill, take heed that you don't forget the Lord your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt, lest Adonai, your God, grow angry at you and wipe you off the face of the land. It's almost parallel to what we have here. I forgot exactly where this passage, but there's another one. Again, this notion of taking heed, be careful. The language again, I just had it. Hishamru lachem is take heed. So this passage is parallel a number of times in Deuteronomy. It's a big concern by the author of Deuteronomy. And the prophets were also concerned as well about affluence leading to ingratitude, rebellion, and ultimately to idolatry. A passage in Hosea states, "It was I who bestowed on her, Israel, the new grain and wine and oil. I who lavished silver on her and gold, that they used for Baal." That was the one of the leading other theological systems at that time. So Professor Kimmelman shows that what the second paragraph is really about is a challenge. He writes, the second paragraph of the Shema takes up one of Deuteronomy's core challenges. namely how to shower Israel with largesse without inducing betrayal. So that's, I think, the key. There's also another key difference, I think, very significant. We talked about, I mentioned that in paragraph number 1, it talks about teaching your children. Vishinantam livanecha. In the second paragraph, it also talks about teaching children, but here the word is different. V'limadatem otam. You shall teach them. Now, limaid is the more common verb for teaching. Lilmod, talmid is a student. Lilmod is to learn. Lilamed is to teach. But in the first paragraph, it's vishinanta, which comes from actually the word for teeth, shane, because the tooth is very sharp, and shinanta means to, let's see, how do they translate it here? Well, it just says teach them. Okay, but basically it's like drill them, really drill it into your kids.
Diligent.
And
teach them diligently.
What? Oh, teach them diligently. Okay, so that's a way of their explaining it. Heschel has a great teaching from Rabbi Simcha Bunim, who's one of the Hasidic masters. Simcha Bunim taught the commandments you can teach. Right, that's the second paragraph. Focuses on the commandments. He goes, the commandments you can teach, that's fairly easy to do. But to understand faith and love and loyalty to God, to teach acceptance of the kingdom of heaven, that is a much tougher job. That is why it says, Vishinantam, you shall drill this truth home to your children. And Heschel adds, it's much easier to teach observance than it is faith. How to put on tefillin can be taught in a couple of lessons. The basic rules of kashrut can be mastered in a short seminar, but how and why to love God takes a lifetime to learn. I think that's a really appropriate teaching. All right, let's do it in a few minutes. We're going to do the third paragraph. Probably not giving it to do, but here it is. The third paragraph has 2 parts. First part is about the tzitzit. Let me get down to English here. First part is, instruct the people, Israel, that in every generation they shall put on tzitzit on the corners of their garments and bind a thread of blue to the tzitzit, the fringe on each corner. Look upon these tzitzit and you will be reminded of all the mitzvot of Adonai and fulfill them. So the first part is, you see this device, which is like a mnemonic device for the eyes, and you remember to do all the mitzvot. We'll ask in a question, why looking at the tzitzit reminds us to do all the mitzvot. And you won't be seduced by your heart nor led astray by your eyes. Then second half is, then you'll observe all the mitzvot. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. That is I'm the Lord your God. That is a core principle, that God is the Redeemer, the Liberator. Okay, so biblical scholar Israel Knoll suggests that the word tzitzit, because it's not really good translation of it, may derive from the word tzitz, which was the headband worn by the high priest and tied in back with a patil techelet, a thread of blue, of this special blue color. On it were written, Kodesh Lashem, Kodesh Ladonai, holy before the Lord. Wearing the tzitzit, we are asked to serve God in a holy way, much as the priest did. Thus, the paragraph commands us to be holy before God, and the act of wearing tzitzit turns us all metaphorically into high priests. Okay, so that's a big responsibility when we put on the head tefillin. Now, also, how does the looking at the tzitzit remind us of all the mitzvot? So it's actually a fascinating story about how we have techelet today, because techelet was a special color. It was made of a special dye, and the principles of how they made it were lost. The Talmud gives some directions of how of the animal that the tzitzit dye was made from, but it's not clear exactly what animal that was. So since the dye was very valuable, so basically what happened was the Romans took over a monopoly of that color. Nobody could make it but the Romans by the 2nd, 3rd century, and it was just lost how to make the tzitzit. So instead, what happened for thousands of years is we used white, just plain white tzitzit, as a substitute for the color. Techelet came from this specific source, and years ago it was rediscovered using archaeology, the Talmudic sources, and modern chemical science, which were developed in the Israeli fashion industry. I forgot, there is a source, I think it's on techelet.net, that tells you the story, which is just amazing. So today it is possible to observe the biblical mitzvah. The significance of the knotting of conventional tzitzit is still meaningful, though. Knotting with techelet was never actualized, but only theorized by different scholars. So there's many ways to tie the techelet tzitzit. There are a lot of different customs. The way that the white tzitzit are tied, which was done for thousands of at least 2,000 years, and the way it means that by looking at those tzitzit, you would remember all the commandments, is at least the traditional way of tying the white tzitzit there's 5 knots and there are 8 strings. So that's 13. And wait, so that's the 5 knots and the 13. Wait, I forgot now why the third. No, wait. First of all, the word tzitzit, it starts there. The word tzitzit in gematria is 600. It comes out to 600. Then when you tie the 5 knots and the 8 strings, you've got 613. So when you look at the tzitzit, you remember to do all the mitzvot, the symbolic number 613. There's another way of looking at it. The way it's tied is in between each of the knots, the windings are 7, 8, 11, 13. Again, using numerology or the gematria, 7 and 8 are 15. Well, that's the Hebrew numbers Yud and Hey. The 11, you break it in half, that's 6 and 5, that's Vav and Hey. So now you have spelled out God, the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God. The last winding in between the last 2 knots is 13. Again, that 13. Well, 13 in gematria is echad. So when you look at the windings of the tzitzit, you spell out Adonai echad, the Lord is one. So that's another reminder of the importance of the tzitzit, why we remember all the mitzvot when we look at it. According to the traditional explanation, when they had the color techelet, we're told that by looking at the blue color of techelet, blue is the color of the ocean. The ocean reflects the color of the heavens. And so when we look at the tzitzit with the blue techelet, we are reminded of looking upwards into the heavens and remembering where the 10 commandments come from. Also, we should mention that there's an important egalitarian message. Who wore techelet? And we even know it from English phrases. You know, you're born to the purple, royal blue, right? This notion that only the wealthy, the nobility, had this color techelet because it was so expensive. But for the Jew, the average Jew, every Jew was supposed to have techelet in his talis, in his tzitzit. And so every Jew is part of that nobility, that mamlechet kohani, that kingdom of priests. So it's for every Jew, not just the wealthy. A couple of other connections here between the paragraphs. We've already talked about the relationship between 1 and 2, but between 1 and 3, there's a connection. 3, the question is, how do I overcome my lust? How do I overcome that Yetzer Hara that wants to go and be seduced by other lusts, right? Because it says here, you should not be seduced by your heart or your eyes. Well, paragraph number 1 already had the solution. You put it on, you put the words of the Lord, this 10 command, the Shema and the 4 paragraphs that we have in the actual words of the Torah. There are 4 paragraphs. You put them on your hand, on your arm, and you put it between your eyes. So that having it on you is a way to stem the potential of going astray. And the closing line, Adonai, Ani Adonai Elohechem, it not only draws us back to the 10 Commandments, which we started with today by saying that it's really not necessary because you have basically the core ideas of the 10 Commandments in the 3 paragraphs of the Shema, but you have here, Ani Adonai Elohechem, Adonai Elohechem we go right back to the beginning of the Shema, Adonai, Ani Adonai Elohechem, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. So we're back to the beginning, and you have to et Adonai Elohecha. So this whole this 3 paragraphs, and this is the point that Rabbi Killen makes, is that it's really a literary piece that has a beginning and a middle and an end, and then it reverberates to the very beginning again. So it's it's circular in that way. So that's the relationship of the 3 paragraphs to each other, and how each paragraph has a significant meaning. So, okay, so that is the last 2 paragraphs of the Shema. Next week, we're going to talk about the relationship of the blessing right before the Shema, because the Shema is a unit. It's bigger than just the 3 paragraphs. The blessings before and the blessings after also contain a unit. And we're going to look at the intro to, where are we here? Ahava Rabbah, the introduction to the Shema, which is about Torah, focuses on Torah. And then the first half of the let's get it here. The first half right here of the blessing after the Shema, which focuses on the last part of the 3rd paragraph. Okay. All right. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, but we're gonna. Let's close. Oh, come on. What is this? That's not it. There's it. Okay. Oh, one of these days. Okay. All right. So that's that's today, and then next week we'll look at those other materials, and we'll cut off now, and in 10 minutes we'll come back with Megillah, Daf 10. All right, see you guys. Take care. Chag Sameach. Don't forget tonight, 6 o'clock.
I thought it was 5.
No, 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock for the Hanukkah program.
Okay, very good.